Our liberties we prize, and our rights we will maintain. This is Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast, where we tell stories about the contribution Iowans and the state of Iowa has made to advance the civil rights movement. Past stories are being told, present actions will be highlighted, and preparation for the future will be discussed. Here is your host, Eric Ganyange.
Welcome to the Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast. The Tuskegee Airmen was the first African-American flying unit in the U.S. military who fought during the World War II. They were trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Tuskegee, Alabama. This was the only training facility for basic and advanced flight training for black pilots of the U.S. Army Air Force. Out of 1,000 black pilots who were trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield, 12 of them came from the state of Iowa. My guest today is Bill Spriggs. His father, Thurman Spriggs, was one of those 12 men who were trained at Tuskegee, Alabama. Hey, Bill.
Hi, Eric. How are you?
Good. How are you? Well, welcome to the show, Bill.
Thank you.
The more I was digging about your father, man, the more and more I got interested and excited. And for some strange reason, I thought all you three kids were born in Iowa. And then I realized, your father ended up moving to Virginia.
Correct.
Did he then live in Washington, D.C.?
Eventually, he ended up in Washington to study at Howard. I point out to people, because everybody gets fascinated with the Tuskegee Airmen, but I point out to people I did have a mother. And my mother grew up in what is now the city of Virginia Beach, but then that was Princess Anne County. There was no high school for black people in Princess Anne County when she was growing up. There was a black Catholic high school run by a mission called St. Joseph, which had several black high schools throughout the South. Eventually, the one black accredited high school in her area, which was in Norfolk, agreed that students in Norfolk County and in Princess Anne County could pay tuition. So my grandparents paid tuition, and she was one of the quote-unquote trolley car students. She would have to catch the trolley car to go to Norfolk to go to high school. So this is the one black high school for we call it the south side of Hampton Road. So that would have been, at that time, Norfolk County, the city of Norfolk. And how I explained to people, so that's why my father moved.
Wow. Wow.
My mother did her first 2 years of college along with my dad. They had the support of my grandparents to watch my older sister, Patricia. I still consider that quite remarkable. My mother was an excellent student. She was on the dean's list with my father. I know a lot of people talk about the trials of being a single parent, but I think it's also astounding if you're a newlywed and a mother and a student. You have 3 masters.
Absolutely.
She went on to finish at Howard. And then when I was growing up, she got her teacher certification. I had the chance to study along with her. In particular, I remember she was doing American history, and they were on the Civil War. So she would be reading her textbooks, but she would go to the library and then get me children's books on the Civil War. So I could study along with her.
Okay. So how did your mom ended up in Iowa? Because that's where your mom and your dad met. Because
when they agreed that black women could serve in the Women's Auxiliary Corps, which they later named the Women's Army Corps, the WACs, the concern was where would they train them? Of course, there was huge concern about their safety if they trained at one of the southern bases. So the WACs were trained at Fort Des Moines, both black and white.
Oh, it was integrated?
Well, the WACs were not integrated, but the training facilities were. So it's peculiar because they kept to sort of Iowa tradition of not having segregation. So if you look at pictures at Fort Des Moines, you see that the black and white women ate in the same facility, unlike what would have happened with men. And so it was half and half of the women were together in a way, but they trained in their separate units. There were the black WACs and the white WACs. My mother was trained in the motor pool, and as one of the few blacks who had a high school education, she was a sergeant. So she was a sergeant in the motor pool. She was trained to be a sergeant in the motor pool, which of course was peculiar because she didn't know how to drive. And it's funny because even though my father was a fighter pilot, he didn't know how to drive either. His youngest brother, my uncle, Lacey Spriggs, who became the first black public school principal in Des Moines, he had to drive them on their dates.
Interesting. I want to get to your dad, man, with his accomplishment and the things that he has done.
Mm-hmm.
So your father was one of the 12 Iowa Tuskegee Airmen. He was born in 1921 in Des Moines, Iowa. And I did not know until you told me this. You guys have long history in Iowa.
Yes. My father's mother came from a family that had been in Iowa since 1850. She had it on both sides of her family. So her paternal grandparents came from a community in Fayette County. These were blacks who were free in area that borders North Carolina and Virginia. When Nat Turner did his revolt, the ability of free blacks to exist was severely limited. So the early 1800s, they left, initially some settling in Indiana, as they did, then Illinois. When they were in Illinois, Iowa was just becoming a state, and someone from Fayette County, the Volga River basin there, and recruited them and said, why don't you come and settle here? So there's a small community of blacks who settled there. So that was on her paternal grandfather's side. On her paternal grandmother's side, she descended from a slave born in Virginia, somewhere in the Shenandoah Valley. The master moved to Missouri and freed them. And in 1850, they made their way to Clinton, Iowa.
Okay.
And so her roots run deep in that way. So she had very, 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 very deep roots in Iowa.
Wow. Now, your father was the eldest of the 7 kids.
He was the eldest, and he grew up absolutely fascinated with radio.
Oh, really?
Because he was born in 1921, the first radio station in the United States, KDKA in Pittsburgh, got licensed in 1921. Radio then was the combination of television and the internet.
Yeah. So the radio was just coming up when he was born.
Yes. And absolutely fascinated him.
Oh, wow. And he went to Des Moines East High School.
He went to Des Moines East High School. The family lived on DeWolf Street, and they were on the part of DeWolf that then backs onto a huge railroad right of way. So it looks like they had a giant yard because it was their yard plus then this right of way. And my grandfather made lots of cutouts from wood and essentially built a playground for them. That was this giant playground behind the house.
Him and his 3 brothers in Des Moines High School, they won 6 state championship in track and field?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
So if you go back and look at the history of track championships in the state of Iowa, there's this string of championships that Des Moines East won overlaps with when there was a Spriggs on the team. So my dad, being the eldest, he was the first one onto the team. My uncle, that we called Henry, but his name was William, Bill Spriggs, and my uncle Lacey, they were all on the track team. And so in that span of time while there was a Spriggs on the team, they just dominated Iowa at the same time.
When did he graduate from high school? 39, 40s?
Yeah, he graduated in 39. One of his classmates was also a Tuskegee Airman.
Oh,
so,
really?
Yeah, so people talk about the 12 who were the pilots, but at the time my dad was a Tuskegee Airman, there was a whole unit that was being trained as bomber crews. So in addition to the pilots, they were also the members of the bombing crew. And so he had a classmate who was the navigator and ironically the radio man for a bomber crew. That was how my dad ended up as an airman, because he really, really wanted to do radio. He wanted to be a radio man.
Oh.
And he was taught by several teachers at Des Moines East who had fought in World War One. And one of them explained how poorly prepared they were, that they got drafted, they got very little training, and then there they were on the front lines. And he was determined that wasn't going to happen to him, and he fully appreciated what was going on. In 1939, Hitler had already started the war.
Yeah.
We just, as a nation, hadn't joined. So my dad volunteered ahead of Pearl Harbor. He was already in the Army. So when Pearl Harbor occurred, he was already in the Army. And there's a very interesting article, because he came home, he got leave near Thanksgiving in November. The Des Moines Register ran an article on him because, it was kind of unusual for people ahead of Pearl Harbor to be in the Army. And so they ran a piece on him. And then, ironically, the next month is Pearl Harbor.
Oh, wow. So now he graduated in 1939. When did he enlisted? Because he volunteered in 1941?
No, he volunteered ahead of 1941.
Okay.
So he actually enlisted in 1940.
So he did not have that much of a break. Right after high school, basically, he almost kind of jumped in.
Yes, but again, there weren't that many opportunities initially, because there just weren't that many opportunities for blacks. He was going to study for the postal exam. And that's what he and his friends had set out to do. The family didn't have money for him to go to college. So with that being ruled out, he had jobs as a short order cook and the type of typical kind of jobs that black men could get. My grandfather had been a building engineer, and that's the kind of job you could get. But, when it was so clear that there was going to be a war, he decided he should volunteer ahead. And so he served in the cavalry, because at that point, if you were black, you were assigned to one of the units that we now know of as the Buffalo Soldiers.
Yeah.
There were 2 black cavalry units. And so he has the distinction of having served with one of the Buffalo Soldier units and also as a Tuskegee Airman.
How did your father ended up being one of the 12 Tuskegee Airmen pilots from Iowa?
So he constantly put in to transfer out of the cavalry. And he had this love of radio. So he was told, well, if you really want to do radio, you probably want to see if you can be one of the guys with the Air Corps. So he took a test, scored very high, and so he was transferred out of the cavalry into the Army Air Corps. But again, he wanted to be a radio man, but they also give them another test when they got there. And I guess it was a test of their psychology or whatever. And so they said, no, you're going to be a fighter pilot. So,
and what year was this?
So he didn't get to the airmen until late. He wasn't transferred until 44. So the first set of pilots got trained, and then they were sent overseas, first to fight in Northern Africa, and then they were stationed in Italy. The second group, my dad's group, were being trained for the Pacific. So the bomber wing and the fighter pilots were being trained to go to the Pacific and fight Japan. And while my dad was doing his final training in California for actually being, where they, like Top Gun, where they actually train you to do dogfights, the war ended.
Did he get a chance to go overseas then? Probably not.
No, he didn't. That bomber wing didn't finish their training before the Japanese surrendered. Several of his classmates, because they loved that opportunity to fly, stayed in. They all found out that if they wanted to continue to fly, they were going to have to be in the military, because none of them would be hired by civil aviation. This is another one of those instances where people, just don't get it. They think that Black people are made to be non-competitive. You get inferior education, you don't know anything, and you're made non-competitive for the technology of the day. And of course, after World War II, that's when civil aviation exploded in the United States. That's when the airlines really grew and Americans took to the air instead of the train. So people forget, well, I've heard of the Tuskegee Airmen, so if there are 800 and some Black men who knew how to fly, why didn't any of them get one of those jobs? And it's because they weren't going to get hired. I mean, all of us who are the kids of the airmen have heard the stories of those men. And remember, they didn't have names that identified them as being Black in those days. And so the airline sees this person who says they served in the Army Air Corps, that they were a pilot trained by the United States. And so they would get interviews. And then the moment they walked in the room, it was like, oh, no.
Yeah.
They looked at them in their face and just told them no. The answer is no, don't come back. One of my dad's classmates who stayed in through the Korean War and then briefly in Vietnam, he was an armor pilot. He had been trained as a fighter pilot with my dad, but he switched over in the Korean War and then Vietnam. Ashby did get to be a commercial pilot, but he was the only one, and it was tragic in the sense that it was near the end of his career because, pilots had mandatory early retirement. And that's an issue that, they're debating even today about, when should they be forced to retire.
Yeah.
One other pilot was hired, but not for a fixed wing. He was hired to be a helicopter pilot for a service that took you from the Pan Am building over to LaGuardia. And those are the only two of the 800 and some who got to be commercial pilots.
I'm trying to make this make sense in my mind. So you have these pilots who they were being highly trained and they flew airplanes in the most stressful environment. They come home, you think they're not qualified enough to fly commercial flights? It's crazy when you think about it.
Oh, it is. And I didn't know this till, maybe about 3 years ago. Similar to what went on with the Tuskegee Airmen. In World War I, radio was brand new. Because remember, we didn't have a commercial radio station until 1921. When the United States Army went into World War I, the United States Army only owned 2 radios. They were both German-made. This is how revolutionary radio was. And the advent of the radio was so they could talk to pilots. Because before then, the radio had only been used to send Morse code. But with pilots, you can't send them Morse code. And so they had to be able to talk. This is revolutionary. And the 2 Black combat divisions that went over to World War I, well, they had to have communications officers who could do radio. So the 325th Field Signal Battalion were trained, and just like there were the Tuskegee Airmen, Tuskegee won the competition among the historically black colleges to be the home of that training, Howard won over being the place where the radio men would be trained initially. Then they all went off to a fort in Ohio for their final training. But these men were trained in radio, telephone, and telegraph operation. And as you pointed out, they had to do it under combat.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them won the Bronze Star, did so because the Germans had narrowed in on the communications post. They bombed it, they shelled it, and they actually hit it directly. So the roof got torn off. And when the roof got torn off and the building collapsed, it cut the wires. And these four men had to reconstruct while they're being shot at. I mean, bombs are falling all around them. They had to get the communications board back up and rewire it.
Yeah.
And then one of the shells hit the ammo dump there at the headquarters. So in addition to the shells falling, then you're dealing with the explosion from the ammo dump. They successfully get this communications board back up.
Wow.
That man who won the Bronze Star comes back home. He did not get a job in radio, telephone, or telegraph. And again, like you said, if he could do that with bombs falling all around him, don't you think he could do the job? He went on to become the longest-serving president of Kentucky State University in its history, and they still revere him. But when you look at the history of all of those men, none of them got jobs in radio, telephone. So there was kind of a warning that having skills
doesn't mean nothing.
Doesn't mean anything.
Yeah,
and skills that rare skills
mm-hmm.
at the advent of an industry. And just similarly, the airmen are rare skills. It's not like everybody knew how to fly.
Yeah. Now, your father overcame all these things. First, let me go back. In 1944, he's going from Des Moines, Iowa to Tuskegee, Alabama for this training.
Well, he was stationed in Oklahoma and Texas. That's where they had put the Buffalo Soldiers. Remember, they still didn't like black men in combat.
Mm-hmm.
There was still the sense, despite the long, very long history of black men in the American military, showing that they could fight from the colonial war, the Revolutionary War, all the way through. So despite that, they didn't like them in combat. And so he was stationed in Oklahoma and Texas, and then he gets sent to Alabama for his flight training.
What did he talk about? Because, I mean, that's completely two different levels of segregation and hostility from Des Moines, Iowa to Alabama in the 40s.
He recounts how dangerous it was for them to leave their base.
Oof.
They would be attacked by white people.
Oh, wow.
And it happened to him. There are other Tuskegee Airmen who tell a similar story where, as they moved about in the South, German prisoners were being put in the South. There were German POW camps throughout the South. And seeing that because the trains were so crowded at the time, they would put the German prisoners in the white cars and continue to segregate the black soldiers. And a fight took place because my dad was refusing to be segregated. He was traveling under orders to California, and so he had a ticket from paid for by the United States government. He's in uniform. Mm-hmm. He's a lieutenant in the United States Air Corps, and they refused to let him sit anywhere he wanted to on the train. But, he's coming from Des Moines. He'd never had to be in a segregated car.
Yeah.
He didn't go to a segregated high school. Yeah. He'd never been segregated. So in his mind, if I'm a lieutenant in the United States Army and we're at war, then
that should be the last thing in people's mind.
Yes, but they'd rather treat the German prisoners who were shooting their husbands and their fathers and their brothers and their sons. They'd rather treat the German prisoners as privileged compared to their own countrymen who were trying to fight for them. This is the irony of it. When the black troops were in Europe, the attitude of the Europeans were, you're on our side, and our sons our fathers and our husbands are the ones whose lives are on the line. You're over here with us, so we don't care what color you are.
Mm-hmm.
But here in the United States, no, we care what color you are. Germans are white, you're black.
Yeah.
And so even though they're the enemy and you're fighting for us, no, you still are going to be sick.
That's crazy. Now, in 1945, your father come back home?
He mustered out, got married. He got married in December of 45.
Mm-hmm.
Then he and my mother settle in her hometown and settle in Norfolk. At the time, of course, the universities in the South were segregated. The black public university in Virginia was Virginia State University, which was in Petersburg, and there was a 2-year college affiliated with it in Norfolk. And so what was then called the Norfolk Division of Virginia State University had a 2-year unit, and then if you finished there and you wanted to get your degree, then you had to get to Petersburg. So after 2 years, my dad and others from the Norfolk Division, what is now called Norfolk State University, would catch the train to Petersburg. And by train, that's about a 50-minute train ride at the time. So they would catch the train up to Petersburg, and he finished his degree there. And then Iowa, there were several states, Iowa was one of them, that gave their veterans a bonus. They decided that those who served had given up this opportunity at earnings.
Mm.
So they compensated them for some of their lost earnings. So my dad took his check, which happened to have come at just the right time for him, to fund his way to get a master's in physics.
And he went crazy with education after that. It seems like nonstop.
Well, yeah. Well, and again, to his credit, because things hadn't really opened up. This was like on speculation. I will get this training and maybe it'll turn out right. Now, the war created a weird atmosphere because all the work to get the atom bomb. So physics ended up being one of those fields where they didn't discriminate. Now, part of that has to do with the uniqueness of Einstein. Einstein was very well known to be someone who fought for equal opportunity, especially for blacks. And though Einstein taught at Princeton, a little bit down the road is Philadelphia. Princeton isn't that far from Philadelphia. And so he would also give lectures at Lincoln University, which is one of the oldest black colleges in the country. And so physics was a field that was open. And then you have that a lot of the refugees who came over, the Jewish refugees from the Holocaust, were physicists, those who had to flee Nazi Germany. And so you had this combination of this leadership from Einstein within the field, but others who were leaders in the field had fled Nazi persecution. So they had no tolerance for American racism. This is like stupid to them.
Yeah.
And so there was this opportunity
Interesting.
for blacks in physics to excel. So oddly, you couldn't do engineering.
You could not do engineering, but you could do physics?
You were not going to get hired. You just were not going to get hired. And so you have this thing where you do physics and you'll succeed, but if you do engineering, you're going to regret it.
Then he started basically pushing himself through all these hurdles and get the top-notch educations year after year after year after year to become a professor. And by the way, him and your mom, they were married for 63 years before your mom passed in 2009.
Yes.
That's incredible.
It's a definite role model.
Yeah.
It's, the best role model is do as I do.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people say a lot of stuff, but do as I do is a better role model.
Oh, yeah. Then he became a professor?
Yeah, so he got his master's from Howard. One of his classmates had been working at the Naval Ordnance Lab, remember, this is the time when we were beginning to harness the atom. So we went from you could explode the atom to you could harness that energy. And the Navy was quickly trying to figure out how to get nuclear ships. So they had a whole host of physicists that they were hiring. And again, because it was the government and Truman had already gotten rid of segregation within the government, there was this desperate need for physicists. Black physicists played a key role. It was a continuation of his service, his military service, that he was helping to design the nuclear navy, even though his specialty was particle physics, which is what you would need for the reactors and the engines. They were also called in to solve the problem of launching missiles from submarines. So he continued in that vital service, and that gave him the way to then support his next step, which was to get his PhD
in physics.
And
at the Catholic University. Where's that Catholic University at? Is it in Virginia?
So Catholic University is practically across the street from Howard University.
Okay.
If you're on the Howard campus, Howard's campus sits on a hill. And when you're standing on the hill, you can look over and you can see Catholic University. So he got his PhD there, then got hired by Howard to be a physics professor there. He taught there for 3 years and helped to launch their PhD program. So he taught some of the earliest PhD students in Howard's physics department. But then he got a call from his undergraduate alma mater, Norfolk State, went down to help establish physical science and physics at Norfolk State. Norfolk State exploded in size, and at one time was the third largest Black college in the country when my dad was teaching there. So he literally taught thousands of Black students physical science. It's a requirement for graduation.
Wow. In 2006, your father was inducted with the rest of the other 11 guys into Iowa Aviation Hall of Fame in Greenfield, Iowa. Then in 2010, he was in Iowa African American Hall of Fame, and he received George Washington Carver Medallion from Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa.
And unfortunately, when Simpson got around to doing it, my father was too old to travel. And so my Uncle Lacey, again, who was the first Black principal in Des Moines, he went down and accepted it on my dad's behalf. But when we went to the Iowa Hall of Fame induction, my dad was able to travel, and my uncle went along with us. Now, before the induction in the Iowa Aviation Hall of Fame, there was a dedication of the P-51 Mustang outside the Iowa Air National Guard.
Yeah.
And so that stands there with the names of the 12 pilots engraved. That celebration, it was a dedication to the airmen, but also a rededication of the Fort Des Moines and bringing it back alive so people could go and see the history of Fort Des Moines. In addition to my mom in the WACs during World War II and World War I, Fort Des Moines had served as the officer school for Blacks who served in World War I. And one of the most famous people trained there was Charles Hamilton Houston.
And he lived to be 95.
Yes.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for your time today.
Well, it was great talking to you. And thanks for taking some time to talk about my dad's contributions. It was fun talking to you. His life of service and his accomplishments, they earned being celebrated. And just to appreciate how much it was a life of service, if you look at his yearbook picture from Des Moines East in 1939, it says his ambition was to be a writer. He didn't end up chasing his dreams. And he always reminded me that, there's that practical thing. You got to put food on the table. And so it really was a service that he used his skills, not where his dreams would have taken him.
Absolutely.
And so there are lots of contributions that he made that gave people the opportunity to pursue a path that in 1939, no Black person could have begun to dream would be possible. Lots of what he encountered, I didn't know. Because both he and my mother, in order to succeed, never dwelt on the barriers. They were quite adamant about that. And my obsession when I was growing up with the horrors of Black history was like, okay, but that can swallow you. You have to look forward. They didn't dwell on it.
Interesting.
And the other great gift they gave me was to remind me that path that they had to take when they were studying at Norfolk State. They had to live in public housing. They constantly reminded me that but for the grace of God.
Yeah.
They were quite clear that
not to dwell on it.
They got a lot of breaks, and don't ever think that somehow or another you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth, because you weren't.
Why do you think they did not want to dwell on the barrier?
You have to keep the prize in front of you. If you're going to sit up there and worry about the hurdle, then you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Their lesson was, yes, the hurdles are there, but don't
focus on them.
Don't focus on the hurdles. Focus on the finish line.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Great to talk to you.
Great talking to you, and I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. That was Bill Spriggs, man, the son of Iowa Tuskegee Airman Thurman Spriggs from Des Moines, Iowa. Thank you for listening to Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast. Until next time, be safe.